Unit 2, Section 1. Today we're going to talk about the southern colonies. The southern colonies, mainly there were five of them. We're going to talk about one, and that is the one that I'm going to show on the map here is Virginia in green. There were five of them. Of course, Georgia was one. The southern colonies obviously were the southernmost colonies of the original 13. And they differed from the New England colonies and the Mid-Atlantic colonies in much the same way as we've already discussed previously. First, economically, the southern colonies tended to depend upon one single cash crop, and that single cash crop was tobacco. Economically, the southern colonies were started by joint stock companies. Joint stock companies are a new way of financing the colonies that the English begun, and that is where you have a group of investors. This is a page taken from a book listing the original investors that supplied money to start the colony of Jamestown. The positive side of a joint stock company, the good part about starting a colony with a joint stock company is one, you share, the investors share the risks and they share the rewards. So if the colony makes a lot of money, they share in that profit. But also, if the colony goes belly up, fails, then they only lose their share of their investment. They also, by pooling the money, they're able to do things like advertise back in England to get more people to come to the New World. This is a poster that was published in England to try to encourage new settlers to come to the New World. As I said earlier, tobacco becomes the most important cash crop in the early Jamestown colony. Here's a picture of what tobacco looks like as it's being grown. Here's another picture of what the finished product may look like. So once you cut those leaves of tobacco, you would dry them out and then either chop them up finely or chop them up roughly for sale in the colonies, and then also were shipped to England. But with this tobacco, because tobacco is such a labor-intensive crop, you see an increase in slave trade in the New World. Here's a drawing of what it may have looked like on the first trade of slaves from Africa to England. And here 19 Africans are being traded. And what we know from history is these guys may have been indentured servants, not lifelong slaves. We also know that it's mostly in the 18th century that you see the largest number of slaves traded to the English colonies. This chart here shows this is the year 1700 and this is the year 1800. You can see that this was the largest growth in slaves brought to the New World. They were brought here as part of something known as transatlantic trade. In world history, you may have talked about it as triangular trade, and that is where raw materials were traded from the colonies to Europe. Your manufactured products were traded with the Africans for more slaves. Slaves were brought to the New World, and just for example, they may be brought to the West Indies to produce sugar for the production of, let's say, rum. And then rum would be traded back to Europe for more manufactured products. The route that the slaves were brought to the New World on became known as the Middle Passage, and it's signified here with the three arrows that you see coming from where most of the Africans were traded from, which was Western Africa. Africans had a tremendous influence on the development of American culture, and one example is deep fat frying, shown here. Another example is the use of rice and okra in many different recipes found in the United States today. And another example would be the meal of gumbo. And this is signified because in Africa they had access to lots of seafood, pork, and they grew a lot of rice in Africa, so this was a delicacy. This was a staple meal in Africa. The language that was spoken in the New World by the slaves was known as Gullah. And Gullah it's important for us to know Gullah because uh, there were many different tribes in Africa, and all of them spoke different dialects. And so when they were brought here as slaves, they could not communicate with each other. And so this common language developed in the New World known as Gullah. And here's an excerpt taken from the Bible, and you can see the type of language that was used by the slaves. The slaves, because of the monotonous work that they had to do in the fields and all, they brought different types of music elements to the New World, call and response, uh, uh, not rap as you know it today, but poetic music. Uh, that's what they used in the call and responses that they did. And today, that's where a lot of the rap music comes from. They would sing religious songs. To start with, there were songs made up about their religion, which was polytheistic in Africa. But eventually, they came to sing hymns from the actual Bible. They used these in the fields for work songs, and then when they were off, they used this as a form of entertainment. Government. The southern colonies differed from the New England mid-Atlantic colonies in the sense that most of its people lived far apart from each other, so they came to depend more on legislative assemblies. One in particular that we're going to talk about was in Virginia, and it was known as the House of Burgesses. Notice the similarity between this building and what you would see with the nation's capital today. On one end, although this building modeled more of England's version of a legislature, a parliament, one side was where the House of Lords would meet, and the other side's where the House of Commons would meet. Notice the design of the building is very American, very much like what eventually the Capitol is going to look like in Washington, D.C. The main thing you need to know about the House of Burgesses is that it was the nation's first representative assembly. Just like the other two regions of English colonies, the Southerners had both good times and terrible times with Native Americans. To start with, in the South, in Jamestown, they had excellent relations with a group of Indians known as the Powhatan, shown here in this drawing, mainly because of this man in the center of the drawing, John Smith, who was able to negotiate um, good treaties with the Indians, and the Indians were more friendly and helped the colonists with food and materials. But when John Smith was injured and had to return back to England, you would no longer see peaceful meetings like this between Native Americans and the colonists. And eventually, these turned to bloodshed between Chief Powhatan, shown here, and the settlers that were left to fend for themselves in Jamestown. Two wars were eventually fought, and the English in Jamestown were able to defeat the Powhatan Indians and maintain their presence east of the Appalachian Mountains. Another conflict that occurred in the South was known as Nathaniel Bacon's Rebellion. About the same time as King Philip's War up in New England, this aristocrat led a bunch of angry frontier farms people in Virginia against the royal governor of Virginia. They were upset with the royal governor because they believed that the royal governor was trading with the Indians at the expense of the colonists. They attacked Jamestown. They burned Jamestown. The governor escaped to England and came back with troops. In the meantime, Nathaniel Bacon died from natural causes and the rebellion failed. But the most significant part of Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion that you need to remember is that it was the first rebellion in the colonies against the king. This concludes Unit 2.